Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to Wisdom of Crowds. The Jeffrey Epstein story, with all of its sordid details, will simply not go away. It is currently tearing the MAGA world apart. Conspiracy theories in general seem to be a permanent feature of our political life. You can't get away from them, I can't get away from them, and chances are we both half believe in at least one of them. Why is that? Our guest this week is the writer Matthew Walther, editor of a magazine called The Lamp and columnist for the New York Times. He's written eloquently, most recently last week in the New York Times, about conspiracy theories and the role that they play in modern politics. Conspiracies, according to Walther, are like myths. They're wrong, but they're also an important way that modern people organize information. You won't want to miss this episode. But before that, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paid subscriber if you're not one yet. You'll get access to, among other things, the whole conversation with Matthew, along with other subscriber-only benefits. And don't forget to give us a like and a review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
Welcome, Matthew. Look, I want to talk to you about Epstein because it's what everyone's talking about. We're a little late to it because it's been going for 3 weeks now? Well, it's been going for years. I just want to say I recall an essay of yours in The Week many years ago, which I just thought was the greatest thing ever, which, I think gets at something about the paranoid style in American politics. And then, I told Santi, our producer and general impresario, about this, and he told me to look at another essay of yours. We'll include both of them in the show notes that you wrote for The Week about this stuff. I guess I want to just talk about conspiracy theories and just see where this takes us. One thing for me, I was talking to colleagues at the Washington Post. One of my colleagues said something along the lines of, what conspiracy theories do you believe in? Because, we all believe in at least one, I think. So I don't know. I guess maybe I'd start the conversation off that way about, conspiracy theories, just putting my cards on the table. I'm from the Balkans. I feel like being from the Balkans gives you this kind of double perspective on conspiracy theories. You believe that they're everywhere, but then also you don't believe the conspiracy theories themselves. It's just sort of a double decker. I don't know. We'll get to Shadi as well, but what's your relationship to conspiracy theories? Do you believe in any?
I'm trying to think what would count, because that's the thing where, because conspiracy theories, I think, play this important role, not just in national myth-making, but in a more ready-made sense as a kind of tool for opposition parties, opposition politics. To some extent, the designation of conspiracy theory, it's sort of like cult, right? Is it a conspiracy theory if you believe it?
Right.
But I'm trying to think. I don't know. I like to think that I'm a member of what during the Bush days, in a different context, we used to refer to as the reality-based community. I would say that I'm tempted to believe. I'm tempted to believe that some of the animus against Nixon that led to Watergate being taken seriously is a few steps removed from somewhere along the line from Nixon not being aggressively pro-Taiwan.
Wow, that's a good one. I mean, the Nixon stuff ties into Kennedy stuff as well. Like there's a real sort of through line into all the conspiracies from Kennedy. I mean, there's a bunch of sort of stuff that bubbled up about. I think you might know this, Matthew. Maybe Shadi, you do. I think I even wrote about it at some point. But Nixon was talking to. Maybe his director of the CIA, and was saying something along the lines of like, I know what you guys were doing at the Bay of Pigs. And like, I don't know, it was almost conspiratorial in the sense, like it came out in the Nixon tapes. And he was alluding to like, we know what happened to John or something like that. And then, that like, again, the deep state got to him. I don't know, Shadi, you're from Egypt. You're no whatchamacallit,
stranger,
shrinking violet when it comes to conspiracy theories, right?
Yeah, I would actually say that the Middle East is probably the premier league for conspiracy theorizing, more so than the Balkans. I think that like the creativity that's on display, and it actually shows that Egyptians in particular are creative, innovative people when it comes to imagining new realities and all that sort of thing. But I think that part of the reason is that conspiracy theories are more common in what were once great civilizations and great nations. And I think that when you're contending with your own fall from grace and making sense of your decline, you need to have a way to make sense of the dissonance between who you are and what you think you should be. But then again, that doesn't really fit so well with America, because America is, one of the most successful civilizations, or at least nation states and ideas in human history. So it seems kind of odd. I've always struggled to fully understand the paranoid style in American thinking. It seems like, as someone who's born and raised in the U.S., I don't really have any attraction to conspiracy theories. Like, we live in a fucking awesome country. Why do we have to like make up stories about a decline that doesn't even really exist? Of course, people perceive our decline, and that's maybe part of the issue, is that that's not reality based per se. It's about vibes and feelings. But those are just some initial thoughts that I put out there. Maybe Matthew, what's your sense of? Is it odd that conspiracy theories are common and in the U.S. context?
Well, let me even just like to get my own like digs on it, on the conspiracy theory thing, because like I never fully believe in them, but like what the Epstein story, and I always sort of hesitate to say this out loud, but like I find all of this delightful, and it's a dark thing to say because it's such a like grim story, but like there's something. The like mentality this gets you in and the rest of it. And I think just to prompt you, Matthew, to like talk a little bit more about like how you approach this stuff. But one thing that jumps out is that like there's something about American politics and about like thinking the worst of your opponents, which is, and like the level of belief, as you were saying, whether it's a cult and like how true the belief is and how important it is and what role it plays in. Like when Epstein, ended up, dead in his jail cell. I mean, one of the first things that sort of bubbled up into it is that like, obviously Hillary Clinton had him killed to protect Bill, because he was somehow in all of this. And I don't believe that, but it's sort of an amusing thing to say. And largely because, like I already am drifting to the right, and like, politically, that's satisfying on some level, even though if it's somehow play acting. Now, I think like when you really get into it, it's far beyond play acting. What we're seeing now politically play out is more real, and it seems to be having like real implications in politics. But anyway, talk to us a little bit, Matthew, about like your approach to like thinking about the role of these things in American politics.
Sure. So I think if you back up it to the 90s, because you just mentioned Bill and Hillary Clinton, right? One of the things that I find so interesting about conspiracy theories in American politics, just in my own lifetime, so going back to 1990, is that, certain names and motifs are recurring, right? Kennedys, Clintons, rigged voting machines, And what's so amazing is that these stories, almost on a dime, can become useful to one side or the other. I mean, it absolutely blows my mind to see how quickly sort of bland centrist Dems, how eager they are to talk about this Epstein stuff.
Totally.
It's interesting because, again, go back to the Clintons, right? In 1994, how many people who were reading The American Spectator or listening to Rush Limbaugh really, really thought that Bill Clinton was running this kind of combined drug and sex trafficking? Sex trafficking is another one of these, motifs that comes up over and over again, out of this weird, like, regional airport in Arkansas. Because it's interesting, it took up a lot of, people paid a lot of attention to it. It sold a lot of magazines. It sold a lot of ads on talk radio or whatever. But George W. Bush gets in office, and he's, the preferred candidate, even of some of the, people who are pushing this stuff, as opposed to someone like McCain. Why doesn't Alberto Gonzalez do the Mina investigation or whatever? And in a similar way, like when Obama gets in finally, why didn't we figure out how Bush stole 2 consecutive elections? The hanging chads, and then the RFK was the cover story in Rolling Stone. I remember eagerly reading it when it showed up in my mailbox. The rigged.
Wait, what is the
machines.
RFK thing?
So I can't remember when the piece came out, but sometime in 2005, I want to say, RFK Jr. wrote a cover story for Rolling Stone, basically alleging that George W. Bush had won the state because the company that made the voting machines rigged them somehow. Okay. Now, nowadays, if you say this kind of thing, it's weird because there's a summary judgment for like $100 billion or whatever, and people lose their jobs. In those days, we just said, oh, of course, Rolling Stone would say that. You could be a harmless, like, left-wing kook in those days. But what's amazing is that I guess, like, the pattern for me is always that for a long time, was that these things are valuable when you're in opposition, but when you're in office, I mean, who cares? Like, remember, like, why didn't Biden all the anti-Trump lawfare stuff? They're going after all this decades-old, tax stuff or whatever. Why not release the P-tape? Why not?
Right.
All the Russia stuff, these connections. I mean, I remember seeing Jonathan Chait. He had this chart that looked like a fucking Russell Crowe's trailer in A Beautiful Mind, showing how Trump had been working for the KGB, since 1987 or whatever. Well, why not just put all that stuff out? And the reason is that it's useful when you're in opposition, but then it isn't. And I think what's interesting here is that it looks right now like some non-zero number of Trump supporters haven't gotten the memo that that Epstein stuff is just what we talked about.
Let me just jump in. I think that's really it's really astute. I've felt that, and I've said this to friends and colleagues, that to me what's hilarious about this, because Trump's at the core of both of them, but like for the left it was the P tape, and now for the right it's weirdly this sort of stuff. Now it's weirder here because this is their man perhaps at the center of it somehow. But I was going to say, just before you spoke, I'd say, well, the real innovation here is that Trump took his, like, in his base, the most fervent conspiracists and put them at the DOJ and the FBI. People most obsessed with this story, put them there. And, promised. I mean, I think it's safe to say that Trump himself has never really been personally invested in this so much, but he was just like, whatever. And then like let them go. But and I would say like that's some sort of innovation. But you're right, because to a certain extent, the Biden folks didn't dwell on the P tape, but like the Russiagate investigation and Mueller and the rest of it about like Russian malign influence and the rest of this was a big leitmotif in all of this. And it took a long time for it to come up to nothing, but they kept their base hooked on it for a very long time and allowed all the most rancid left-wing stuff to really flourish, I think to the detriment of sort of belief in democracy in a way much more toxic than whatever this Epstein stuff is, which is, like low-grade paranoia, obviously horrific, sex trafficking, and now most fancifully, the involvement of Mossad and some sort of like intel agency and stuff like that. But, so I'm starting to think that maybe there's less of an innovation in Trump than meets the eye. That in fact, the Biden folks with Russiagate and, not explicitly the P tape, they were playing a similar sort of game with Mueller and the rest of this. Because, again, I was writing about this, as Trump got elected. On the face of it, there's nothing to the Russiagate stuff, like literally nothing to it. You could always say, well, maybe there's this and maybe there's that, but like it looked like nothing, kind of like Epstein looks like. If you really take a step back and you're not invested in the story, it looks like a bunch of nothing to me. And yet it was fed by both parties, right?
Yeah, but if I could just jump in, I mean, at least the Russiagate stuff was a response to a particular and even somewhat rational need that Democrats needed a way to explain how they could have possibly lost to someone like Donald Trump. This was never supposed to happen. You need some kind of story to kind of close the gap on that mysterious, puzzling question. It's less clear to me what kind of purpose is being served with the Epstein conspiracy theorizing. Like, what does it really explain that can't otherwise be explained? It just doesn't seem compelling to me in like any obvious way. And maybe, Matthew, you can kind of help guide us a little bit. Why are there some people who are legitimately obsessed with this? Why? Like, I think that for a lot of people who will be listening to this podcast, it probably is mysterious to them why this is such a big deal.
I would just say though, Shadi, have you not talked to like your normie friends who like have been deranged, as Matthew was saying, to this extent, like normal Democrats who are like, there's something here. You've not experienced this? Like,
do I really have normie friends?
Okay, I mean, I don't. I mean, normie even within the DC context. I've had like
I have
people...
had no one talk to me about Epstein. Granted, I haven't
goodness.
necessarily been. I'm not bringing it up, so I don't know why someone would. I just have
several
you been hearing...
of my group chats. It's like come up and we just like end up talking about it, and like these are not conservatives. These are not QAnon. These are not like MAGA types. This is like
why though?
Dems.
Why is this important? What is it explaining?
Matthew, I mean, take a crack at it, however you want.
But again, that's my point. Is that this is what makes the Epstein thing so interesting. Is that it's now useful to Democrats in opposition, in the same way that it was briefly useful to MAGA types, and that's what maybe makes this conspiracy so interesting. Is that it's not? Imagine this, right? Like, imagine if Bernie had been talking about like Mina Airport or something. These things are these stories are supposed to serve only one side. Even if some of the motifs, like rigged voting machines, literally every detail is pretty much recycled. A decade and a half later or whatever. I think the Epstein thing, I think its power and its utility come from its kind of key to all mythologies quality, right? Because if you think about the Epstein thing as like a loose, idiomatic way of talking about the sort of small c post 1989 small c constitution, this world of like reduced state capacity, everything, so much power concentrated in the hands of these, transnational financial interests. It's a great story, and it's much easier. I think I said this in the Times the other day. It's a lot easier to talk about Epstein, release the Epstein files, than it is, for some guy, at a bar, like in a town in, rural Southwest Michigan where I live, to like read, Anton Yeager on hyperpolitics, or like Wolfgang Streeck, even though that's exactly what this is. That's my sense.
Yeah, and first of all, we should remind everyone to read your New York Times piece that deals with some of these issues in detail. It's a really great piece.
And I want to talk about like specifics in there, claims about that, you don't think this will actually in the end matter that much against Trump. But before we get to that, go ahead, Shadi.
And of course, we'll include a link in the show notes and all that. But you do allude to this in the piece, and we've been sort of skirting around it. To what extent are these beliefs really actual things that are believed, or are they being instrumentalized in a kind of opportunistic way? It reminds me a little bit of the how 2/3 of Republicans to this day still say that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. And our friend Musa El-Darbi wrote about this a couple years back, making the point that the people who say that the election was stolen from Trump don't really believe it. They're using it as a stand-in. It's a way to signal you're anti-establishment. You don't like the establishment, and this is one way of getting at the establishment, saying that you don't believe in the election results. And I think he said that there is a kind of small literature on how people troll pollsters. So they're just trying to signal something instead of saying we actually believe the election was stolen. Because if they really believed the election was stolen, they would have presumably been out in the streets and resisting, and even perhaps taking up arms, because that would mean the end of American democracy as we know it. If that election was stolen, you would see mass mobilization on an unprecedented scale. But the fact that people weren't mobilizing means that they didn't actually, it's revealed preferences. That's another way of thinking about this. You judge people not based on what they say, but how they act. And the fact of the matter is that they weren't acting in accordance to their supposed belief. So with that as some background, Matthew, do people really, like, to what extent are these beliefs deeply held versus they're just talking about Epstein conspiracy theories as a way to say that they don't like the establishment or they hate the establishment?
No, I think making the stop the steal connection there is really good, because I would say, just to flesh that out a little bit, stop the steal, I think initially, you could kind of divide it up, and you could say that you definitely have people for whom it's just a vague, anti-establishment kind of signaling device. And then you have people for whom it is a useful myth to explain the fact that on all the fundamentals, honestly, at the time of his State of the Union in January 2020, the disorganized Dems, Trump looked like he was in a really strong position, especially for somebody who's gone through all this impeachment nonsense and the Russia stuff, to be reelected. And so stop the steal, I think, again, is, for some people, was a kind of a narrative rather than an analytic means of giving voice to this sense that we had the failed impeachment, we had the Russiagate thing, we had all of these rule changes as far as how people could vote, spread across these various states. The GOP apparently was too stupid or too cowed to challenge. The deck was totally stacked against Trump in every conceivable way, and he still won more votes than he did in 2016, and that seems sort of impossible or out of tune with the zeitgeist. They just couldn't believe it, and they felt like it was unfair. Do they really believe? I don't know. I don't even know. It was never clear to me like what the maximalist version of Stop the Steal would have been, like the Men in Black or something, changing it on the computer. But but as far as the level of conviction, I think you have, I would break it up into, a few groups. You have the people who just, it's the equivalent of, remember I remember when I was in high school, after that biopic came out, everybody liked the Johnny Cash Folsom Prison middle finger T-shirt. It's kind of like that. For some people, it's like that. In the same way, like, remember the Obama birth certificate thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When I was, 18, 19, living in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, I remember these guys. Remember the old Got Milk stickers?
Mm-hmm.
There were these bumper stickers that people had, and it said birth certificate in like the Got Milk font. But that was not like these people had no like serious convictions about where Barack Obama was born. They probably didn't even vote. It was just a way of like they're not even civically engaged to be registered, much less like keep up with their change of address forms or whatever. It's just a way of saying, fuck you. But then for the people in the middle who I think maybe are at least politically engaged in some sense, the truth is that decline in, basic like media literacy, the fact that people, get their news in this hyper fragmented way, like you see a stray tweet here and you see this and then somebody sends you a video or whatever, like they can't even articulate what it is that they think presented Trump with some serious structural disadvantages in 2020, in the absence of which he probably would have won. Because that's a complicated story to tell, and they don't even have access to the necessary information to tell, to get the raw material, much less to synthesize it into something digestible. So instead, they just say this. And then the third group are, these are the diehards. But for me, that's the most interesting group, especially in terms of the Epstein thing, because their epistemology is so malleable that having decided, how the story ends or, whatever, there's nothing that can actually change it. I mean, remember when Trump talked in his first term about having one of the first things I did was go look at the JFK files, whatever the fuck that means. And then he's like, trust me, if you had seen even, 1% of what I saw, there's no way you would want them to be released. And then they do it, and it's just a bunch of crap. I mean, the most interesting thing that I saw in there was about the historian Hugh Trevor Roper and how it turns out that he was part of MI6 longer than a lot of people knew. And nobody cares. Nobody's talking about that, because I'm the only person in America, as far as I know, who believes that Lee Harvey Oswald was, a confused communist maniac who got a lucky shot off.
Right.
And
Except
the president.
Except, I mean, the Post just ran a thing from the JFK stuff saying, again, like that there may have been connections, more, again, things that the CIA has been lying about for a while about connections within Oswald and itself. And now, like, that's been confirmed. In fact, there have been connections. They were recruiting in Miami and whatever. So again, that doesn't get us to anything more, except the fact that the CIA has been lying for decades when prompted with this exact question. So it's an interesting parallel to this sort of Trump stuff, right? Is that there's so many ways to play. For example, the game after the Wall Street Journal publishes that expose late last week, based around this letter that he sent to Epstein early, before Epstein was even arrested the first time, with a body picture, like drawing of a naked woman and something about like shared secrets or whatever the hell the quote was. An easy answer to that is just like, yeah, that's right. This is old news. We were friends back then. You know what happened? He got arrested for like soliciting an underage woman. We stopped being friends before that happened. That pedophile pervert. Like, I'm out, and nothing you hear, nothing to see. Instead, he's like, how dare you even release this? I'm going to sue you. And he's suing the Wall Street Journal now for it, which is again, just like pouring more sort of, embers on the fire, right? Like it's a bizarre sort of thing, about, again, like the cover up is much worse than the crime, if there even was a crime, right?
Well, that to jump back in again for a second, that gets at perhaps my single favorite thing about conspiracies, which is, I sometimes think of it as like the subjunctive epistemology of conspiracy theories. And to explain what I mean, I'm going to go to like the mother of all conspiracy theories, which is, Holocaust denial, right? And I always posit this thought experiment of the hypothetical philo-Semitic Holocaust denier. This guy who's like, 6 million Jews. I mean, there's just no way. If you look at the angle on the smokestacks and all that, there's no way it checks out. But if that had happened, it would be the worst thing ever because, I'm, love Jews or whatever. But instead, David Irving, David Duke, anybody who is part of the vast and varied literature of Holocaust denial, basically their position is it didn't happen, but also the Jews had it coming. You know what I mean? And it's this weird thing like that. And it's the same thing that you see now. I've actually been amazed, I will say, by the number of I thought maybe slightly more respectable right of center opinion people who just went with hoax immediately.
Yeah.
But for the most part, what I've seen is not that. It's, this is a nothing burger, and also it's probably fake. And that is what you see so often once you get into the conspiracy space. This thing where you're saying simultaneously that it didn't happen, but if it did, whatever. And that kind of elasticity, I think, is maybe what is most striking about all this for me, because it's just a mental space that I can't. I mean, I try to think about, I try to think about some cause or something where I feel like I really have a side, like a real rooting interest. The closest I could come to would be Michigan football or whatever.
It's always sports.
Yeah, right. Because I do remember, actually. I mean, maybe this is a good analogy, because I remember, when we were accused of, employing this nefarious agent to steal other teams' signals. I was like, you have no fucking evidence. And also, if we did, that just proves that players and coaches at Ohio State are stupid, because change your signal. But the stakes there are football.
Yeah.
Not, so I don't know.
But, Shadi, before you jump in, I just wanted to say, build on one thing that you were saying before, and I just want to drive this point for both of you, because I want to, do one thing about this, which ties into bigger questions that we often discuss here about, democracy and the wisdom of crowds, as it were. It's the question of intention. You were talking, Shadi, about Musa's theory, and we've kicked this one around before on the podcast, which is, if people had known or really believed that the election was stolen, they'd be out in the streets rioting and I'm not sure that's true. I think like there's a core question there to ask, you know, like, and it's the role of beliefs. I think like, you know, there's a danger in the way that we've been talking about it here that I just want to like pull us back from, which is to actually take this stuff seriously. And I think, Matthew, like what I've liked about your writing about this is that I think you make an effort not to sneer at this stuff, is to actually like take it on its merits. And so it's like, you know, let's take it on the merits that people may believe that the election was stolen, and in fact will be like, yeah, the election is stolen. Those thieves, we'll get them next time. And, you know, they're like, well, you know, our guy's still fighting for us. And that's really kind of what Trump like tapped into. Trump never said the election wasn't stolen. In the end, he's still like riding that one. And he's like, but we won this time. And one could argue that like that helps justify a lot of his vindictiveness at this point and legitimates to his base to, or maybe much more than his base to like half the country, the kind of slash and burn anti-institutionalism that he's doing right now. So I mean, I just want to like pull us back a little bit and just maybe accept that like, you know, people really do believe things that doesn't necessarily mean that you know, the revealed preferences you were talking about, Shadi. So I just want to like sort of pump the brakes on that a little bit. You know, I was saying at the beginning that, you know, that essay in the week. And it's just this one passage. I'll just like read it really quickly because I think it gets at it really, really well. He said, you know, you're talking about all the Epstein stuff. And he said, we should keep all of this in mind the next time we feel inclined to sneer at so-called low-information voters, especially the kookier sort. You know the people I mean. Wackos, gun nuts, 8chaners, conspiracy theorists in middle America who watch InfoWars. One of the few journalistic outlets to discuss the issue of pedophilia regularly, and post about QAnon and spirit cooking and the lizard people. The news that a globalized cabal of billionaires and politicians and journalists and Hollywood bigwigs might be flying around the world raping teenage girls will not surprise them in the least because it's what they've long suspected, you know? And I really love that passage because I think it gives, you know, like I said, I fundamentally don't think that there's a there. And if you look at all the sort of trial stuff with Ghislaine Maxwell and like what happened, there does not appear to have been anything more than him procuring underage prostitutes for himself, for his own personal use and abuse, and then, you know, hiring a bunch of young women, not all of them underage, but hiring a bunch of young women to be at these parties. At these parties, you know, with lots of rich men, and, you know, like basically, surely sex happened, surely untoward things happened there. But this idea that he was a pimp of like young prostitutes for powerful men, and there was like a pipeline that went, and he had a list of these people that there was, and then it all builds on top of that. Nevertheless, I do think that like that passage captures and takes seriously this concept of the low information voter. And the reason I want to like zone in on that, because it's like most voters in democracies are low information voters, and most beliefs about the world are not like technocratic beliefs about like how the economy works, about like supply and demand, about the role of tariffs, about like anything really. It's all a bunch of signals and a bunch of like I don't know, I would call it like emotional affectations. And the genius of democracy is that nevertheless it works despite all low information voters, right? Like that to me is the fascinating paradox. It's not that there's wisdom in people, right? Go ahead,
we've
Shadi.
also argued on this podcast that low information voters are underrated,
right?
That they can actually be good for democracy because they have less conviction. It's really smart, well-educated people who have very strong convictions. I mean, that's why communists and socialists would always, you know, the ones who actually lead revolutions are very well educated. That's not a mistake. So in some sense, you want to have enough low information voters, and you don't want too many high information voters who are ideologically rigid, because they do tend to be ideologically rigid. That would just be the kind of case for low information.
Yeah. I don't know, Matthew, wherever you want to take any of that.
Oh, sure. So I think one of the things just to follow on the question of, well, why aren't they rioting in the streets or whatever, if they think the election is stolen? I mean, one point that I always try to drive home is that the fundamental social form or organizing principle, or however you want to think of it, of our decadent late imperial civilization is not, a republic with universal suffrage. It is, globalized capitalism that where I think most people can have these feelings like the election was stolen, but at the end of the day, what do they care about? They still just want to go watch their shows on Netflix and get that shit mailed from Amazon or whatever. So I think I think it's I guess what I would say is that I think people can simultaneously feel like American democracy or whatever is in really bad shape at that. Their lives are still basically fine. I mean, this is definitely true for a huge segment of Trump supporters, people I would call, I borrow this from Paul Fussell, high proles. When we talk about class in America, the group that gets overlooked most often are like the people who, in some county in the rural Midwest, the guy is like the excavator or like gravel king, or like he owns a beverage distributorship or whatever. These people make a lot of money, but their outlook is based, and their sort of cultural horizons are those of, the guys for them, right?
Yeah.
And so in a very real sense, like economically, they're doing basically fine. And so, absent some kind of massive change to that, especially certain structural changes that maybe intellectual Trumpist scribblers would actually want, which might hurt their bottom lines. They're pretty much okay with whatever. So they like the anti-establishment posturing and all that. But the truth is that when Trump says, "Oh, we're doing a 90-day pause on tariffs because the stock market looks bad," that's that's good for them. So I guess I just don't. I think that this kind of post-political maintenance of the post-1989 shape of the economy, or I would even say like the post-Carter shape of the economy. I mean, that's the funniest thing. Again, we're talking about conspiracy theories. In 500 years, everyone is going to remember, anyone who reads books, that there was this whole thing about whether, Kennedy, the American president, was assassinated. Nobody's going to remember Carter's deregulation of airlines and all this stuff, even though, that's the effective breakup of the post-war consensus on the mixed economy that sets in motion the whole world that, these myths that we're talking about now, I think, are trying to explain.
But so just to build on that though, it's a good point about the Carter stuff and like the technocratic stuff versus the myth making. But it's the other part that drove me up the wall, and still continues to drive me up the wall. Is our collective, elite obsession with the very. That's it for part one, dear listeners. There's a lot more where that came from. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, please head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and become one. Help support our work. Hope to see you in the bonus.